Welcome and thank you for being a part of WorkSafe's high-risk crystalline silica work and prohibition of engineered stone webinar. My name is Cameron Ling and I'll be your host for this session. And this afternoon, we'll explore the following topics: how to identify crystalline silica, then determine if it is high-risk crystalline silica work you're undertaking, what the high-risk crystalline silica work regulations require from employers, and the recent prohibition on engineered stone benchtops, slabs, and panels. I'm joined by two WorkSafe experts to discuss this topic. Brian Monk, Manager, Policy and Legislation with WorkSafe Victoria. Good afternoon, Brian.
Afternoon, Cameron.
Great to have you with us. Joining Brian is Halil Ahmet, Principal Hygienist from WorkSafe Victoria. Good afternoon, Halil.
Afternoon, Cameron.
Great to have both of you here today. And we'll be taking questions from the audience a little bit later, but please feel free to start entering your questions at any stage via the Q&A chat box there. I'd love to jump straight into it, and perhaps starting with you, Brian. A prohibition on engineered stone came into effect across Victoria on the 1st of July. Could you give us a brief overview about why the prohibition occurred and who it affects?
Thanks, Cameron. A ban on engineered stone has been introduced by all Australian states and territories, including Victoria, due to an unacceptable risk of exposure to respirable crystalline silica dust when working with those products. Exposure to respirable crystalline silica dust can result in adverse health effects such as silicosis. It can occur across a range of industry sectors where high-risk crystalline silica work is undertaken, particularly in construction and the earth resources industry. However, the exposure to workers in the engineered stone industry has been particularly devastating. Research suggests almost 1 in 4 stonemasons will most likely develop silicosis if they have not already. So the prohibition on engineered stone impacts anyone looking to manufacture, purchase, supply, or install an engineered stone benchtop, panel, or slab, or undertake work on these items. So employers and employees need to be across these issues to minimise risk and ensure they're keeping workers safe and compliant with the regulations.
Brian, just for clarification's sake, what is engineered stone and how can someone tell if the stone they want to purchase to work on is engineered stone or not?
Yeah, so engineered stone has quite a detailed definition in the OHS regulations. Essentially, it is an artificial product that contains more than 1% crystalline silica and is created by combining natural stone materials with chemicals such as resins and undergoes a process to become hardened. It is a very broad definition, so there are exceptions as detailed in the regulations, and some of those are concrete or cement products, bricks, pavers or other similar products, as well as ceramic wall and floor tiles, porcelain or sintered stone that don't contain resin. Those are products that are specifically excluded from the definition of engineered stone.
And how has Victoria introduced the engineered stone process prohibition compared to the rest of the country?
So the major difference is that in Victoria, Queensland and the ACT, the full ban is in effect now and has been since 1 July, while other jurisdictions have had a transition period until the end of the year. We are aligned on many aspects across the country. So the activities prohibited are the same everywhere, which includes the installation, processing, supply and manufacture of engineered stone, benchtops, slabs and panels. The definition we discussed earlier is the same across all jurisdictions. And all engineered stone products that are not in a benchtop, slab or panel form are still permitted. Obviously, there is a lot of engineered stone in buildings across Victoria and the rest of the country. And repairs, modification and removal of that engineered stone is also still permitted. Some of the other differences in Victoria is that we don't have a notification system here when undertaking work on previously installed engineered stone, and we are maintaining our current exemption framework rather than introducing a new one.
Great, thanks, Brian. Halil, if I could come over to you on this one. As a hygienist, what is high-risk crystalline silica work?
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's 2 ways of categorising it. One is where you're undertaking an engineered stone process, which is any process that generates crystalline silica dust from handling the engineered stone itself. And these are really, the stone itself is prohibited, but there are limited activities that can be undertaken. So it's in relation to those limited activities. The other is where you're undertaking a crystalline silica process. These are identified in the regulations as to what they are, and they are quite broad. So if you're undertaking a crystalline silica process and you're likely to be generating more than half the exposure standard for crystalline silica, then it is a high-risk crystalline silica work activity. Now, it's one thing worth remembering that it's to determine whether you're above half the exposure standard, you can't take into account any controls such as respiratory protection or water suppression that you might have associated with it. So another way of looking at it is high-risk crystalline silica work are activities that are potentially higher risk in terms of a silica-related illness or disease.
And flowing on from that, Halil, how does an employer determine that they are undertaking the high-risk crystalline silica work?
Yeah, well, initially they need to identify if they are, one, undertaking any work with engineered stone. So establish whether that's something you're going to be doing and whether you'll be generating dust from that process, and you're automatically captured as high-risk crystalline silica work. The other is to establish whether you're, as I said, undertaking work that is defined under the crystalline silica processes, and then either undertake a risk assessment, which is also outlined in the regulations as to what you need to consider when you're doing that risk assessment, or you can assume that you're undertaking high-risk crystalline silica work based on it falling under a crystalline silica process. Now, crystalline silica processes are very broad, so it's worth keeping in mind that activities such as the use of a power tool on concrete, bricks, etc., to generate dust is classified as crystalline silica dust is classified as a crystalline silica process. Similarly, if I'm transferring containers or bags of a dry product that contains crystalline silica and I'm potentially exposed to that material, I'm exposed to crystalline silica dust. Or if I'm doing demolition work on a site where there's dust that's generated, once again, another process. And just another final example would be where I'm cleaning up a site and there's settled crystalline silica dust. That's also captured as a crystalline silica process.
And then, Halil, taking the next step beyond that, what does an employer have to do if they are undertaking the high-risk crystalline silica work you're talking about?
Yeah, this is probably relatively easy when you think about it. It's they have to complete what's called a crystalline silica hazard control statement. It's another long term, but the last part of that term is statement. So it's about completing a document, if you like. And it identifies the hazard. So in this case, we're talking about a very specific hazard, the inhalation of silica, the risk, so the potential to cause a silica-related illness, such as silicosis or lung cancer, and then identifying the controls and how they're implemented. So if I'm doing concrete cutting of the street, then I'm using water suppression directly on the tool. I'm containing the water and the residue, and I'm collecting it and disposing of it as I go along. So it's identifying all of those. And really, it's also worth remembering that you can't commence the high-risk crystalline silica work until that statement is completed and is consistent with the controls that you've got in place.
If I could get just a little bit more of you, Halil, on that. What should they do if they're still uncertain?
Yeah, if they're uncertain about the product that they're going to use, and it is a product that is supplied to them, they can go back to the manufacturer or supplier of that product and ask for more information, such as a safety data sheet or other technical information that might explain whether that product has got a silica content in it. If they're still uncertain, they can contact the manufacturer or supplier directly and ask the question. If a manufacturer or supplier is not certain, they can get a sample of that product and get it actually analysed by a laboratory to tell them the crystalline silica content. If it's a product that they're going to cut into and it's not directly supplied to them, they should sort of look for further information, such as on WorkSafe's website for examples of material and the crystalline silica content. Google is usually a very good source, but it is about trusting the sources as well when you're looking for information such as that.
Great, thanks, Halil. Brian, I'll come back to you on this one. Since the prohibition a few months back, what are you seeing in the field? Has WorkSafe visited workplaces to see if employers are complying with the prohibition and their high-risk crystalline silica work obligations?
Yeah, so Victoria has been heavily engaged in the engineered stone benchtop industry for a number of years. We have a dedicated team that was responsible for administering the licensing scheme that was in place prior to the engineered stone prohibition. That team has conducted over 50 visits in the first month of the ban, issuing 25 compliance notices, and took more than 65 samples of suspected engineered stone.
I want to get to some audience questions in a second, but perhaps, Brian, if I could stick with you, if you had any key takeouts for the audience today before we get to their questions, what would it be?
I think it would be to be clear that duty holders need to know whether they are exposing their workers to crystalline silica dust, and if so, what it means if they identify they are undertaking high-risk crystalline silica work. And also to understand that the prohibition on undertaking engineered stone processes is in place, and what that means for you and your workers if you identify engineered stone in the workplace.
Yeah, it's a really important point. Appreciate you sharing that one with us. I want to get to the questions because there's a number coming through. It's obviously a really important topic and one that's pretty fresh in people's minds. This one, a number of people wanting the answer to, and I'm happy for either or both of you to jump in on these. Does this legislation cover concrete dust?
I could cover that one if you like, Halil, in the first instance. So the prohibition on engineered stone does not cover concrete. Concrete and cement products are specifically excluded from the definition of engineered stone. However, the work that Halil was talking about, the high-risk crystalline silica work, does cover concrete products if they contain crystalline silica.
I can add to that a little bit, and it definitely is covered under crystalline silica processes, and if you're generating any dust, it's likely to be a high-risk crystalline silica work activity. One thing I missed mentioning is that if you're already undertaking high-risk crystalline silica, if you're already taking high-risk construction work, you can actually include this type of description of this statement in a SWMS, a safe work method statement.
Great, thanks for that, Halil. This next one, interesting one. What should I do if I discover that I have slabs of engineered stone still at my workplace?
I can jump in. You can jump in after me, Brian, if you like. But essentially, the prohibitions are in place, and if the slabs are there, then there is no productive purpose that you can use those for now. So they really should be disposed of as waste.
Brian, can you add anything to that?
Yeah, it's just spot on what Halil said. I think that there's no use for them now. They can't be installed or cut down to other products or repurposed in any way. So they need to be disposed of as waste.
Great. I might keep you going on this one, Brian. In light of the ban on engineered stone in Australia, what best practices can organisations adopt to effectively manage and mitigate risks associated with crystalline silica exposure, particularly in industries heavily reliant on stone materials?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of alternative products out there, and Halil's outlined the high-risk crystalline silica work regime that does really cover off all the necessary steps that employers and duty holders and workers should consider when working with stone products that typically contain some level of crystalline silica. But in terms of the benchtop industry specifically, it would be becoming familiar and having a look at alternative products that don't expose workers to crystalline silica in their production.
Great. Well, that might flow into the next question then. I might continue with you, Brian, but please, Halil, jump in. How can industry stakeholders collaborate, including manufacturers, employers, and health and safety representatives, to create a comprehensive framework for safely transitioning away from engineered stone while protecting workers from crystalline silica exposure?
It's a big question. I think importantly, that work has already commenced, and we've seen that there's a lot of transition to alternative products occurring in Victoria and in other jurisdictions, as well as they prepare to introduce their full prohibition. I think continued research and really being aware of what is in products before you expose workers to them is really the key. But yeah, that transition is well underway in most jurisdictions.
I might add, if there's any uncertainty, they should go back to the manufacturer and supplier of the product, who will likely be overseas, and ask for analysis reports from laboratories to establish what the product actually contains. They can also do that here in Australia, send it off to a laboratory to gather that information.
Great, thanks for that, Halil. This one, I think I'll go to you, Brian, but again, please jump in, Halil. It appears most engineered stone manufacturers are now changing their makeup to be less than 1% in line with the changes. Is this true? And if so, how can we tell what is compliant and what is not?
It is true, and that's part of the pivot to alternative products that I was referencing earlier, where manufacturers are looking for alternative products that are permitted around kitchen bench tops and other products that engineered stone was used for. The Safe Work Australia, which is the national body that coordinated jurisdictions' input into introducing the prohibition, have identified these alternative products and will be considering the engineered stone prohibition further as part of their 12-month review. The key point which Halil raised earlier was that even if the alternative products are permitted and they are below 1%, that does not mean they are without risk, and duty holders should obtain as much information about those products and what's in them as they can to make informed decisions around their control processes.
Great, thank you. Halil, I'll come to you on this one because, funnily enough, it was a question I had and I got to ask it to you off air, but a couple of people asking it. What about working with granite, marble, and quartz that have high levels of crystalline silica, but they are not banned? You still need to have the same safety processes in place.
Yeah, they would still be regarded as crystalline silica processes. And as such, you'd have to create that crystalline silica control statement or a SWIMS that addresses it. So you would still have to have controls in place. You should still be looking at wet suppression, sort of on-tool extraction to suppress the dust and not get into the employee's breathing zone. Because yes, they still do have crystalline silica content, and you don't want your employees to be at risk when undertaking that work.
Great, thanks for that, Halil. This one here, maybe I'll stick with you, Halil, on it. Is there a view to start a harmonised approach to the silica dust legislation across all states and territories as there are differences?
It's probably a question that Brian can jump in on as
Okay.
well. But there are differences. They are relatively harmonised, but there are differences. And as Brian mentioned, there is a review that will be occurring that will be looking at sort of whether more consistency is required or slight changes needs to be required. I might hand that over to you, Brian. You might want to add a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I can just add that the national system under the model laws, which was introduced only on 1st of September this year to manage high-risk crystalline silica work, was heavily based on the Victorian version that was introduced in 2022. As Halil said, there are slight changes that have come about as a result of introducing it a number of years later. But by and large, they are very comparable and was based on Victoria's system.
Great, thanks, Brian. This next one, happy for either of you to jump in. Why are all industries treated similarly to engineered stone industries where the risks are significantly lower and health monitoring isn't yet demonstrating adverse outcomes even for workers with up to 20 plus and up to 40 years of exposure?
I think firstly, I'd say that not quite agree that they are treated exactly the same. Engineered stone now is prohibited, and so no use can be undertaken with that product. Whereas, as we just said, marble, granite, and other bench tops, as well as the wide range of processes that occur in construction, manufacturing, and earth resources, are still permitted. However, it is important to control the exposure to dust wherever it is generated using the high-risk crystalline silica framework that Halil went through earlier.
Yeah, and it might be worth highlighting that crystalline silica has got an exposure standard. So people should be complying with that exposure standard. And it might mean slightly different controls where the crystalline silica content is higher. But sometimes it's just easier for employees to introduce almost like blanket controls across the board and just to apply them consistently across the board for people to know when to apply them and how.
Great, thank you. This one, if engineering controls are in place, such as wet cutting of natural stone, is it still necessary to wear RPE?
If it's natural stone, it may be a case of establishing through personal exposure monitoring, where you undertake monitoring in the employee's breathing zone, whether exposure is likely to still be above the exposure standard. when they're performing it wet in that process. Hopefully it wouldn't be above, and they wouldn't need respiratory protection for natural stones such as marble. But if it is, then they would need additional controls. But we would still push them to look at better engineering controls before they still opt for the lower order of respiratory protection.
Great, thank you. Brian, I'll steer this one to you. There are new products coming out that are engineered stone with 0% silica. Are these products still banned?
If it's under 1% crystalline silica in that product, and you've been able to confirm that with information from the manufacturer or importer, those products do not fall within the ban, so that does need to be above 1%. But as we've said earlier, if they contain any crystalline silica, the risk controls need to be assessed in accordance with the framework that Halil's outlined.
Great, thank you. This one, I'll stick with you, Brian, but please, Halil, jump in. So does everyone, including concreters, tilers, etc., not just stonemasons, need to do a SWIMS for their processes when working with CRS?
Yeah, so whichever industry or trade you're undertaking, if you're exposing yourself or workers to crystalline silica dust, you do need to assess whether it is a high-risk crystalline silica work that you're undertaking. And if you have a SWIMS already, as Halil said, if you're already doing high-risk construction work and have a statement that documents that work and those controls, you can add crystalline silica processes to that document. If you do not have one of those, you're not already undertaking high-risk construction work, you can create a hazard control statement that just covers your silica hazards.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure who I'm going to direct this one to, so please jump in. Do service technicians or other visitors inside a stonemason factory need to wear RPE? They may only be there for a short time.
It does come back to what they're performing or what they're doing in that workplace. And really the hierarchy always talks about higher order controls. So you'd start saying, okay, so do an assessment, establish what you're going to be doing in that workplace. If you can introduce, if it's generation of crystalline silica dust, then look at higher order controls such as the wet suppression that we've spoken about or on-tool extraction. And then if that's not practicable or if it's still very high levels, then you'd have to start looking at respiratory protection. So it's not a straight answer, I suppose, but it is about doing that assessment.
Great, thank you. Again, I'm not sure where to direct this one to, so please jump in. Will there be any type of licensing needed to remove engineered stone, like asbestos removal, and is that the same licensing as you would need to perform a crystalline silica process?
Okay, so licensing was considered, however, it was not adopted or deemed appropriate way to regulate the removal of engineered stone. So no license is required to remove engineered stone. And additionally to the last part of that question, no specific license is required for undertaking a crystalline silica process either.
Clarification on one here. Is asphalt classed as an engineered stone?
Don't believe it is, Halil.
Simple no, it's not.
It's not. Great. Thank you for that one. What about testing workers? How and how often?
If we're talking about health monitoring, and I'm assuming we are there, the health monitoring requirements fall under the hazardous substances regulations. And the way those regs are structured for health monitoring is if exposure is likely to exceed, it's likely to be risk, and we look at is exposure likely to exceed the exposure standard, then health monitoring should be taking place for crystalline silica. So it's really understanding what your employee's exposure is in your particular circumstances, what you're doing, concrete cutting, whatever the task might be, and if it's likely to be the case, disregarding respiratory protection that it provides, then health monitoring is required.
Great. Halil, I'll continue on with you on this one. Just another clarification one. I think it's you, Halil, I'm directing it to. Is cutting of plasterboard and the dust it produces deemed as a high-risk crystalline activity?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that crystalline silica content is not there with plasterboard, so it shouldn't be a high risk activity. I'd sort of go back to the SDS, and I'd encourage the person who's asking the question to go back to the information product sheet or the safety data sheet on the plasterboard, and I know there is that information to establish any crystalline silica content. If there is, then it would definitely be regarded as high risk crystalline silica work because you're generating a fair bit of dust and cutting that board, but I don't think it would be.
Great. This one, a clarification around some processes. What processes do you need to put into place if you are drilling into concrete or brick walls? Sorry, my screen is moving around here. Dust extraction on drills to catch the dust. Is this for any sized hole, 6 millimeters for green plugs? Hope that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, I think the advancement in on-tool extraction, which is what we're talking about here, when drilling, etc., undertaking power tool type processes, has really come a long way, at least in what is available in Australia now. And I think these regulations, the Victorian regulations, when they were introduced, have really pushed that and encouraged the introduction of better tools. So if you're regularly undertaking that sort of work, such as an electrician putting in brackets for overhead sort of carriageways in buildings, you'd be drilling heaps of holes. So we'd expect that sort of activity to have on-tool extraction on the drill so that the dust is being captured as close as possible to where the dust is being generated.
Great, thank you. This one for you, Brian. So WorkSafe are visiting stonemasons. Are they visiting concreters, tilers, brickies, etc., to make sure they are compliant?
Yeah, absolutely. So the inspections have been obviously focused on the engineered stone fabricators and stonemasons through our licensing scheme over the last few years. However, the broader construction inspectorate have been out there every day looking at crystalline silica hazards in other industries as well. So absolutely, that's a focus of that team.
I'm going to need your assistance on a few acronyms here, so please be patient with me. This next question, a few people wanting the answer to. Some powdered products containing sand list the same CAS number as crystalline silica on their SDS. Will a new CAS number or clarification be included in SDSs, or will analysis report be made mandatory? How will these be verified?
A CAS number is, I think, what's called a chemical abstract service number. It's just a specific identifier for that substance, for that chemical. I mean, it really depends on the substance. Like if it's clearly identified, like if it's a clear ingredient, if it's a specific ingredient, it would have a specific CAS number, a CAS number. So it's really going back to the manufacturer and supplier and confirming with them that is this an ingredient of your product, or have they got an incorrect CAS number for that product?
Great, thanks for that, Halil. I appreciate that very much. What are you guys finding the most effective controls people / work sites are using to reduce the risks?
Yeah, I think it's, I mentioned before that more and more suppliers are coming out with on-tool extraction and wet suppression on tool. And I think if I'm purchasing equipment, power tools of sorts, I should put pressure. I'm encouraging employers to put pressure back on those suppliers to chase those tools up, because they are out there. Other countries have introduced them. We've now started introducing them, and they are readily available. It's just a matter of finding those tools to achieve best practice at the workplace to suppress the dust as close as possible to the source.
Brian, is there any other things you're seeing as well?
I know, just echo Halil's comments there. I think the availability of those new controls that are built on tool, as Halil said, has come a long way in recent years, and everyone should be looking when they're updating or replacing their tools to really look at what's available now, because it is much more commonplace.
Great, thank you. A few people asking this question. SWA are currently consulting regarding the reduction of the RCS exposure standard to half the current levels. If that comes in, will Victoria likely drop their exposure standards as well?
Yeah, so Victoria, along with the rest of the jurisdictions in Australia, is aligned on the workplace exposure standards. So we have the same exposure standard across the range of chemicals, including crystalline silica exposure. So whilst that would be a decision for ministers and governments in the future, in the past, Victoria has been aligned to that.
Great, thank you. This next question, a few people wanting as well. Regarding the requirement for the training of workers in the risks of working with CSS, does the course need to be accredited, or would an online silica awareness training package suffice?
Yeah, look, there's no, sorry, Brian, if you'd like to jump in, go for it. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think there's the new framework that's introduced in other jurisdictions does have a slightly different training requirement, which was one of those differences we mentioned earlier. In Victoria, there are specific elements under the regulations that your training has to follow, but it does not prescribe a particular accredited training course or others at the moment. It's making sure it hits those elements around what's the hazards associated with crystalline silica, and what are the controls in place at that particular workplace, and how do you employ them? If you wanted to add to that, Halil.
Well, just online courses. There's nothing in our regs that talks about online or not online. However, you really do want a course that allows someone who's attending it to be able to ask questions and get some feedback and have some sort of evaluation process. So sometimes the online courses don't allow that. And I think you really want to get the best out of a training course for your employees. So you really need to consider that.
Brian, you're talking about monitoring on sites just before. How can you conduct monitoring on building sites where there are significant changes in the environment every day, with new sections of the building being completed or workers moved?
I think Halil's definitely the expert on workplace monitoring, so I might get Halil to cover that one.
And it's a fair question where there's a lot of activity or a lot of variation. And sometimes you need to look at task-specific monitoring so that you can use that on building after building or site after site. So you might have an activity of doing a demolition from within a cabin. So you might monitor an employee within the cabin over a few days and establish that for the likely exposures on other sites as well. It's similar. You look at, try and focus in on the task and do some personal monitoring of employees in the breathing zone, as I mentioned earlier, to try and gain an understanding. And if there's variation, then you might resort to the worst case monitoring data that you've received on previous cases.
I might continue with you, Halil, on this one, I think. When engaging with a labour hire company, who has the liability for ongoing health assessments if there is an ongoing exposure to silica dust?
Yeah, like if it's the employer that's engaging people from the labour hire company, they must ensure that the health monitoring is provided. So sometimes it's a case of maybe the labour hire company and the employer negotiating how that's done, but the employer has to ensure that that is done. So if a WorkSafe inspector rolls up at a WorkSafe and there are labour hire employees, they have to ensure that it's done. But if the labour hire employees are employees of the labour hire company still, then it's their responsibility also.
Great, thank you. I'll open this one up to both of you. What assistance can WorkSafe provide for businesses who are unsure how to assess and manage their exposure?
I think first point would be to say there's a lot of information available on the WorkSafe website. There's detailed guidance on identifying and managing crystalline silica processes. There's also templates available of the documents that Halil was referring to before around hazard control statements. So that would be first port of call for assistance in getting compliant with those regulations. And if there's any issues finding or accessing that material, our advisory line is the best place to contact to get some help with that.
Yeah. I'd add a little bit more in terms of if someone's uncertain about levels of exposure in their own workplace and activities that they're undertaking, then they can engage an occupational hygienist to come out and actually monitor their employees to determine what their actual exposure levels are and whether further controls may be required.
Great, thank you for that, Halil. Next one here. Do I need a permit to remove and dispose of engineered stone? where can I dispose of engineered stone?
Yeah, so no permit or license required to dispose or remove of engineered stone. Disposal and removal is an accepted task to the prohibition, so that can occur and needs to occur, obviously, in the future as these places are being renovated or demolished. And the EPA govern the waste management in Victoria. However, it is just to any typical landfill that you would take engineered stone to.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Brian. Will WorkSafe be enforcing RPE for natural stone if workers refuse to wear it?
Well, we'd be asking the employer, what have they done to implement higher order controls? So if we establish that controls are required, there's a hierarchy under the hazardous substances regs that applies to processes involving crystalline silica, and the hierarchy starts at eliminating, substituting, isolating, engineering, etc. And then PPE, respiratory protection, is the last option that they should consider after they've implemented all the others. So we'd be saying, what's your engineering controls? Why haven't you implemented them? Implement them first, and then let's review whether respiratory protection is required. And then if respiratory protection is required, then we'd say, what training have you provided? What supervision have you provided to ensure that employees know how to wear it, why to wear it, etc. And that's what we'd be pushing first.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Halil. This next one, and a few people wanting the answer to this one, regulatory impact. How do you see the recent ban on engineered stone affecting the overall regulatory landscape for construction and manufacturing industries regarding silica exposure?
It's a big question. I think it's one of the maybe first times, or at least in recent times, where governments have come together relatively quickly to ban a particular product outright due to its risk to health of workers. Obviously, historically, asbestos has been in that category as well a number of years ago. But I think what it shows that I guess it's just important for everyone involved in workplaces, from duty holders, employees, HSRs, to make sure they're identifying all the hazards in their workplace, and in particular, in this case, exposure to crystalline silica, and having those controls in place. But I think it also shows that governments and others are willing to move and step in and ban products that pose an unacceptable risk to workers.
Just a clarification one here. Will there be any compensation for businesses that had to dispose of old stock, silica-containing stock? And what about compensation for the ESL that are now redundant?
Yeah, so a question for government around compensation. None has been announced in relation to those duty holders or others that have been using engineered stone previously. In relation to the ESL, which I think is engineered stone license holders in Victoria, they would have received a communication from WorkSafe around a refund to their license application fee. But beyond that, there hasn't been compensation set for users of engineered stone.
Great. Will there be any training requirements for workers and duty holders as a minimum to supervise the work?
Yeah, it's a standard requirement. If you're dealing with a hazard in your workplace, the employer has to provide some information on the hazard and the risk. And if you're implementing controls, then there has to be some information on the controls as well. So it's a standard requirement that all employees should be providing training to their employees on that.
Great. Another clarification here. Is there a stipulation when removing engineered stone to notify WorkSafe before the work can be done? And if there is to be no licensing requirements, how successful will the harm minimisation to workers be?
Yeah, so in Victoria, there is no requirement to notify WorkSafe prior to undertaking engineered stone processes on stone that's already installed, whether it's for its removal or repair or modification. So that's not a requirement here. It isn't a requirement in some other jurisdictions. So that viewer might have seen some information from Safe Work Australia or other jurisdictions around a notification requirement, but that is not in place in Victoria. And on the question of harm minimisation, I think obviously the overwhelming majority of harm with engineered stone has been caused in its fabrication, so creating new bench tops. Whilst there are obviously risks associated with removal of previously installed engineered stone, they are not on the same scale as fabricating a new bench top, which is what was causing that harm, which is now prohibited.
Makes sense. This one here, just a lot of people asking, is fit testing for use of RPE mandatory, or are fit checks reasonably practicable?
Fit checks are really quick. That should be done every time a respirator is worn. This is about respiratory protection, and every time you wear it, you should be doing a fit check. But that should be standard training for respiratory protection. The regulations don't specify fit testing. It's a more one-off type of, or every sort of so many few years type of requirement. But we don't specify that for silica-related activities for fit testing. We encourage it. It provides greater confidence, if you like, for the employer and the employees around it, but we don't specify it in our regulations.
This one, another one relating to PPE. For companies that produce zero silica benchtops only, is it required to wear PPE such as masks when it's fully wet cut?
Was that about respiratory protection, the requirement for respiratory protection?
Yeah, if they're producing zero silica benchtops only, and it seems like they're talking about using wet suppression as well.
Yeah, I'd say go back to the safety data sheet or the information about the particular product to establish what other hazards there might be in relation to that substance, and to work according to those hazards. Like if it's 0% crystalline silica and there aren't any other hazards for which exposure standards exist, then you could probably get away. Like if it's being done wet, you could probably get away without the need for respiratory protection, but they need to go back to the SDS.
Great, thanks, Halil. I'm conscious of time. I might ask this one more just because there's a few people wanting the answer. What is the responsibility of product suppliers in regards to crystalline silica and the management of dust within factories or warehouses where their cement products are being supplied in bulk?
There's duties in terms of suppliers of substances, crystalline silica substances as well. If it contains greater than 1% crystalline silica, there's specified information in the silica regulations that has to be provided, and that includes like the proportion of crystalline silica in that substance, so that employers can then use that as part of their risk assessment and determine the appropriate controls. Even if that wasn't to apply, you've still got duties under the OHS Act to provide information. So there should be some information that's provided from the suppliers and manufacturers.
Great. Thanks for that, Halil. Thank you to everyone who was asking questions. There are so many more questions there. I'd love to have time to get to them all. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to, but really appreciate so many of our audience engaging with us. A huge thank you to both of our guests today. Halil, Ahmed, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, pleasure, Cameron.
And a big thanks to Brian Monk from WorkSafe Victoria as well as Halil. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Cameron.
Great to have you both sharing your insights today about high-risk crystalline silica work and the Victorian prohibition of engineered stone. We hope that everybody has found this an interesting and informative session. This webinar, along with all of our webinars, will be available on WorkSafe's website in the coming weeks. We do value your opinion on our Health and Safety Month events. So shortly, we will be sending you an online survey. We would love it if you could provide your feedback so that we can incorporate your suggestions in our program next year. All respondents will go into the draw to win one of 5 $100 gift cards. Shortly, we're going to show on screen a list of all the contacts or programs that we've covered today. And if you have any requests for further information, we recommend you to please get in touch. Also, remember, if there is something you want to discuss, there is the WorkSafe advisory line open from 7:30 a.m. until 6:30 p.m. Monday to Friday. And the emergency line is open 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. Thank you so much for being part of this webinar. Have a great rest of the day.